Welcome to Lesson 8.5, Day 2, Quadrilaterals. We're going to talk about quadrilaterals, and you're going to be able to identify quadrilaterals, parallelograms, rhombuses, rectangles, squares, and trapezoids. There's a lot of different vocabulary with this unit as well, so you're going to want to make sure to go slow and pause the video whenever you need to. There are very subtle differences between each of the different shapes, so you'll need to make sure to go slow and make sure you understand each of them before you move on to the next one. First, we'll look at the word quadrilateral. The first word that we see here is quad. When we talk about quad, quad means four. Another way that you can break up the word is into lateral, and lateral means side. So this helps us remember that a quadrilateral is a four-sided figure. So quadrilateral is a polygon with four sides. So any shape that has four sides would be a quadrilateral. So you can draw anything. For your example, you can draw a rectangle, you can draw a square, you could even draw a parallelogram, or a rhombus, or a trapezoid. So here's a trapezoid. Any of these will do. Alright, so we're going to take a look at this and we're going to say, what do we know about this quadrilateral? First, if we look, we know that this quadrilateral, yes, it can have two right angles. That's not always the most important thing about a trapezoid. The most important thing about a trapezoid is that it has two parallel sides. This side and this side. There is only one pair of parallel sides. These two sides, if you were to extend them, would eventually intersect. So a trapezoid is a quadrilateral with exactly one pair of parallel sides. So when you see a shape like this, the first thing you want to look at, does it have four sides? Yes, so it's a quadrilateral. And does it have one pair of parallel sides only? Yes, makes it a trapezoid. So this down here is your definition, and these up here can be your examples. Right, the next thing, what do we know about this quadrilateral? It does have four sides, so it is a quadrilateral. However, in this case, we know that this side is congruent to this side, and that this side is congruent to this side. We also know that this angle is congruent to this angle, and that this angle is congruent to this angle. Another thing, if we look at parallel sides, which is always something that we want to look for, we know that this side and this side are both parallel to one another, and this side and this side are parallel to one another. That's a lot of marks going on one shape. However, when we're looking at our definition, this quadrilateral is what we call a parallelogram. A parallelogram is a quadrilateral with two pairs of congruent sides that are parallel and two pair of congruent angles. You'll notice that here you have two lines, and on this side you only have one line. This helps us understand that only this side and this side are congruent to one another, and this side are congruent to one another. All four sides are not congruent in this case because this one has two lines and this one only has one. Same thing with our parallel marks. This mark right here, this little half arrow, is the symbol we use for parallel on a figure. So this tells me that this side and this side are parallel to one another, and this side and this side are parallel to one another. Alright, again, we have congruent sides. However, in this case, all four sides are congruent. Okay, so if you go back to your parallelogram, this one had two sets of congruent sides. This one has all four sides being congruent. However, it still has two pair of congruent angles, one here and one here. And it still has two pair of parallel sides. These two sides are parallel to one another, and these two sides are parallel to one another. Because it has two pair of parallel sides, and it has two pair of congruent angles, it's still considered a parallelogram. However, more specifically, it's a rhombus. A rhombus is a parallelogram with all congruent sides. It has two pair of parallel sides and two pair of congruent angles. You'll notice as we go on, like I said, there are very subtle differences between each of the quadrilaterals, so you'll want to take your time and know the differences between each of the shapes. Alright, this quadrilateral is a little bit different. In this case, again, we have this side and this side being congruent, and this side and this side being congruent. So we don't have four congruent sides, however, we do have four congruent angles that happen to be 90 degrees. Again, we have this side and this side being parallel to one another, and this side being parallel to one another. So this is still a parallelogram because it has two sets of parallel sides, two sets of congruent sides, and two sets of congruent angles. However, again, more specifically, this is a rectangle. A rectangle is a parallelogram with all right angles. It also has two pair of parallel sides and two pair of congruent angles. So a rectangle is a type of parallelogram, which is also a type of a quadrilateral. We'll talk about all the different names that you can give to one shape in a few minutes. Alright, then we have this shape. We all know what this shape is, but what makes this a square? First thing first, all four sides have to be congruent. Just like a rhombus, all four sides are congruent, so it has the characteristics of a rhombus as well, because also it has two sets of parallel sides. So it is a parallelogram with four congruent sides, which also makes it a rhombus. It also has four 90-degree angles, which also makes it a rectangle. More specifically though, because it has four right angles and four congruent sides, we call this shape a square. A square is a parallelogram with four right angles and four congruent sides. It has to have both to be a square. Alright, so when we're talking about quadrilaterals, we have a little Venn diagram, and you do have this in your notes. If you look right here, you do not have to draw the pictures with it. I do want you to write in the words though. So in this case, we have quadrilaterals, and we have one big group over here that also contains three other quadrilaterals. That big group is the group of parallelograms, which means all these shapes that are in here are all parallelograms. And because this is also in the big circle of quadrilaterals, all of these shapes are also quadrilaterals. Okay, so if you go back to your vocabulary, I'm going to go back here. We said a rhombus is a type of parallelogram. So for that reason, we know that rhombus can go into one of these circles, because a rhombus is a type of parallelogram. Another type of parallelogram we said was a rectangle. So we can also put the rectangle in that circle. Okay, so a rectangle is also a parallelogram, which is also a quadrilateral. But a rectangle, notice the rectangle and the rhombus don't necessarily always intersect. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. The shape that is both a rhombus and a rectangle and a parallelogram is a square. Because if you look back and remember, a square has the 90-degree angles, which is the defining feature in the rectangle, and the square has 4 congruent sides, which is the defining feature in the rhombus. So a square is actually a rhombus and a rectangle and a parallelogram and a quadrilateral. It has lots of different names. In this case, though, the trapezoid is the only quadrilateral that stands alone. No shape in this area can be a trapezoid. And the reason being, a trapezoid only has one set of parallel sides, whereas all of these have 2 sets of parallel sides. So if we look here, here's your trapezoid. These 2 lines here will intersect, so it has only one pair of parallel sides. Or if you look at the rest of these, they have 2 pairs of parallel sides. Okay. This is very confusing, which is why we're going to take some time to work on it in class, and we're going to go over a couple more examples here. Alright, so we're going to give the most descriptive name for this figure. Is this figure a parallelogram? Does it have 2 pair of parallel sides? Yes, it does. So could it be a parallelogram? Yes. Okay. Is it a rectangle? Does it have 90-degree angles? No. So it cannot be a rectangle. Does it have 4 congruent sides? Yes, it does. So can it be a rhombus? Yes, it can. Because it is not a rectangle, we know it's not a square. It doesn't have those 90-degree angles, so it cannot be a square. And it cannot be a rectangle. Because it has 2 paired parallel sides, it cannot be a trapezoid. The most descriptive name for this shape is C, a rhombus. So if you look in your notes, it asks you to give the most descriptive name and then tell why or why not. Okay, so here you would put yes, but not descriptive enough. Because it is a parallelogram, but it's a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides. You can circle, see, and you can say because it's a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides. No, and you can use shorthand here because it has 2 pair of parallel sides. No, because it doesn't have 90-degree angles. And the same thing up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy and paste. Okay, so you have another one that I'd like you to try. And I want you to try it on your own and tell me which one is the most descriptive name and tell me why or why not. Okay, this is not a parallelogram because it only has 1 pair of parallel sides. So therefore, since it's not a parallelogram, it can't be any of these. And your example for that can be the same thing. It only has 1 pair of parallel sides, or you can say because it is not a parallelogram. It cannot be any of these, because all of these are types of parallelograms. So the most descriptive name is trapezoid. Alright, so we're going to give all the possible names for this figure. So if you look at this figure, you have to decide, does it have four sides? Yes. So because it has four sides, it is also a quadrilateral. Does it have two pair of parallel sides? One here and one here. Because it has the two pair of parallel sides, it is also considered a parallelogram. The next shape we can look at is a rhombus. A rhombus has to have four congruent sides. Does it have four congruent sides? Yes, it does. So since it's a parallelogram with four congruent sides, it's also considered a rhombus. Does it have four 90-degree angles? Because it does, this is also considered a rectangle because it is a parallelogram with four 90-degree angles. And the last shape that we look at is square. Is it a parallelogram with four congruent sides and four 90-degree angles? Yes. Since the answer is yes, we can also call this shape a square. The only name that we cannot give this shape is trapezoid because it has two pair of parallel sides instead of only one. Okay, so this shape actually has 5 different names, the most descriptive being square. All right, you have a couple more problems here. I'll do 2 more examples with you, and then the lesson quiz at the end is what you are required to do on your own and to post your answers onto Edmodo. So example 4, a rhombus is also A, parallelogram, B, rectangle, C, square, D, trapezoid. We know it can't be a trapezoid because it has two pair of parallel sides, and a trapezoid only has one, so that's out. Some rhombuses can be squares, however, not all of them are squares, so you cannot put square in here for an answer, because this is an always statement. So it is not also a square. A rhombus can never be a rectangle because a rhombus has to have four congruent sides and a rectangle has two pair of congruent sides. So it is not a rectangle. A rhombus, however, is always a parallelogram because a parallelogram is a quadrilateral with two pair of parallel sides. And a rhombus does have two pair of parallel sides, and it is a four-sided figure. So a rhombus is always a parallelogram. A square can also be called a, can it be called a parallelogram? Yes, it can. We discussed this before. It has two sets of parallel sides, two sets of congruent sides, and two sets of congruent angles. So yes, it can be called a parallelogram. Can it be called a rectangle? Yes, it is a parallelogram with four 90-degree angles, so it can be called a rectangle. Can it be called a rhombus? Yes, a rhombus is a parallelogram with four congruent sides, and a square does have four congruent sides, so it is also a rhombus. The last one, trapezoid. A trapezoid has to have only one pair of parallel sides. A square has two. So a trapezoid cannot be the name for another name for a square. I know this is all very confusing, so I want you to take your time and go over your vocabulary terms very slowly, especially when going over this quiz. Okay, so you have 4 problems here. Remember, there can be more than one answer to a problem. Okay, and make sure you're reading specifically because for this one it says a figure with 4 sides and 4 angles. It doesn't give you anything specific about the sides or about the angles, so be careful with what you pick for this one. When you put your answers on Edmodo, please write them just like this. You can put 1 and then put your answer. And then 2 and put your answer. If you have any questions, please make sure to post them on Edmodo or make sure to come with them ready for class tomorrow.